The crowd roared like thunder, shaking the stone walls of the Colosseum. A man, shackled and trembling, was shoved into the sand. Across from him, the gate creaked open, and a starved lion padded forward, its ribs showing, its breath heavy with hunger. The condemned man's eyes widened, but there was no escape, only the jeering faces of 50,000 Romans demanding blood. To them, this was not horror. This was entertainment. The suffering of flesh was their applause. This is the story of Rome at its most brutal, where cruelty became ritual and death was staged as theater. Some of these spectacles were so grotesque, so far beyond reason, that even ancient writers struggle to describe them without shuddering. And yet, for centuries, the empire celebrated these horrors in the name of glory, conquest, and control. Before we begin, take a moment to subscribe and join us on this journey through history's darkest corners. By doing so, you help keep these stories alive, stories that remind us how fragile humanity can be when power and spectacle collide. The Colosseum rose from the earth like a giant's crown, its arches gleaming under the sun, its shadow swallowing the streets below. To the outsider, it was a marvel of Roman ambition, stone upon stone, tier upon tier, a monument to empire. But to those led through its underground tunnels, chained and waiting, it was not a marvel. It was a grave. Beneath the arena floor lay a world unseen by the roaring crowds above. The hypogeum, a labyrinth of cages, pulleys, and darkness. Men waited there in silence, their skins sticky with fear. Some were gladiators trained to fight for survival. Others were condemned criminals sentenced to die without a weapon. And beyond the wooden bars, lions, leopards, and bears paced restlessly, their growls echoing like thunder in the caverns. The stench was unbearable, a mix of damp stone, sweat, animal musk, and blood that never seemed to wash away. When the wooden trapdoors above creaked open, the arena floor became a theater of torment. The sand, freshly raked, would not remain clean for long. Gladiators were paraded out like champions, cheered by tens of thousands. Some lifted their swords in salute, shouting the ritual words, Ave Caesar, morituri te salutant. Hail Caesar, those who are about to die salute you. It was both a greeting and a farewell, for many would not return. The crowd's hunger was insatiable. They wanted blood, not honor. They wanted screams, not silence. If two gladiators fought well, the audience roared in delight. If one faltered or hesitated, the booing began, and the pressure to kill intensified. A fight that ended in mercy was rare, for mercy did not thrill the masses. Then came the executions. The condemned were pushed into the arena unarmed. Their fate sealed the moment they stepped into the blinding light. Sometimes they were tied to stakes, waiting as wild beasts were unleashed. Sometimes they were forced to play the parts of mythological figures, like Orpheus torn apart by animals or Prometheus chained to the rock. The crowd laughed, cheered, pointed, as real men died in place of myths. To Rome, this was not cruelty. It was tradition, justice, spectacle. The sand itself told the story. Day after day, it darkened with the blood of thousands. Slaves with shovels raked it smooth again, but the stains never vanished completely. Those who entered the arena knew it well. They could smell death, taste the iron in the air, and hear the ghosts of those who had fallen before them. For the spectators, it was intoxicating. The roar of 50,000 voices vibrating through the stone. The emperor seated high above, his thumb poised to decide life or death. Bread was handed out, wine flowed, and for a few hours the common Roman could forget hunger, poverty, or despair. The empire gave them blood, and they loved it. But for those in the sand, time slowed. Every heartbeat thundered in the ears. Every cry of the crowd twisted into a cruel reminder that their suffering was not theirs alone. It belonged to the masses, a public offering of pain. Some gladiators fought bravely, knowing that survival meant fame, fortune, perhaps even freedom. But most never made it out alive. And here is the haunting truth. Rome called these men spectacles. Not human, not citizens, not even criminals, they were entertainment. Their deaths were rehearsed, displayed, consumed. And the Colosseum, Rome's greatest symbol of power, stood not as a temple of culture, but as a monument to suffering. This was blood in the sand, and it was only the beginning. Imagine standing at the edge of that arena. The sun is blinding, the noise deafening, and 50,000 eyes are fixed on you. The weight of their gaze is crushing. You grip the sword in your hand, though it feels heavier than it did in training. Across from you stands another man, someone just as desperate, just as terrified. To live, you must kill him. To falter, even for a moment, means becoming nothing more than a smear of blood beneath the sand. For gladiators, life was a paradox. They were both slaves and stars, despised yet adored. Some were prisoners of war, captured in foreign lands and forced into service. Others were criminals, condemned to fight as punishment. And a few, shockingly, volunteered, seduced by the promise of glory, fame, or the dream of riches beyond a common man's reach. But once inside the ludus, the gladiator school, all were the same, property of their lanista, the trainer who owned their flesh and fate. Training was brutal, hours of weapon drills under the scorching sun, diets carefully managed to build strong, heavy bodies capable of absorbing blows. The Romans called them hordearii, barley men, because of their carbohydrate-heavy meals. They were crafted into living instruments of death. Yet no amount of training could dull the truth. The games were not about skill alone. They were about spectacle. The crowd wanted drama, suffering, endurance. A clean, quick death did not satisfy. The condemned, however, had no such illusions. For them, the arena was a final humiliation. Stripped of dignity, stripped of name, they were paraded as animals. Early Christians in particular were singled out, not merely executed but displayed as a warning. Their deaths became theater, meant to break not just the body but the spirit of a movement. Stories survive of men and women singing hymns even as lions closed their jaws around them. To some in the crowd, this was mockery. To others, it was unsettling, a defiance in the face of ultimate terror. And yet, the Romans cheered. Why? What drove tens of thousands to thirst for such blood? Part of the answer lies in control. The empire was vast, restless, filled with conquered peoples. The games reminded everyone who held power, who decided life and death. The emperor's presence at the arena was not just symbolic, it was theatrical politics. His thumb, raised or lowered, was the final decree. A flick of his hand could condemn or redeem, and the masses saw it as a gift of divine justice. But there was also something darker, more primal. The Romans believed that watching others suffer purified the soul, that seeing death up close somehow strengthened the living. To confront mortality through spectacle was, in their eyes, an act of civic participation. Pain was entertainment, yes, but it was also ritual, binding the crowd together in shared ecstasy and horror. Still, cracks in the illusion appeared. Ancient writers recorded moments when the games went too far, when cruelty became unbearable even to a Roman audience. The execution of children, the slaughter of unarmed women, the endless butchery of animals, all of it began to stir whispers of unease. The poet Juvenal asked bitterly, "What is the use of bread and circuses when the soul itself grows sick?" Even in Rome, some recognized that blood could not forever mask decay. The arena was both spectacle and mirror. It reflected Rome's glory, its wealth, its engineering, its command over nature. But it also revealed its rot, the casual disregard for human life, the addiction to violence, the cheapness of compassion in a society drunk on conquest. And so, the sand remained soaked with blood. Each drop, each scream, each broken body buried beneath the roar of the crowd. For centuries, this cycle repeated. Day after day, decade after decade, the Colosseum consumed the lives of men and beasts alike. And still the people demanded more. When the last scream faded and the trumpets blared their final notes, the crowd dispersed as if leaving a festival. Vendors shouted, children laughed. The smell of roasted meat wafted through the streets. For the Roman citizen, the games ended with a full stomach and a satisfied thrill. But inside the Colosseum, when the gates closed and the shadows lengthened, a different story unfolded. The arena floor was a slaughterhouse. Corpses lay scattered in the sand, broken weapons beside them, pools of blood soaking deep into the ground. The stench of iron, sweat, and entrails hung thick in the air. Workers moved quickly, dragging bodies with hooks, piling them into carts, and raking the sand smooth once more. Death was cleaned up like spilled wine, erased before the next spectacle. To the empire, there could be no pause, no stain left to spoil the illusion. Beneath the arena in the hypogeum, the air was damp and heavy. Here, slaves labored in darkness, hauling carcasses of lions and bears, repairing cages, preparing for the next day's bloodletting. The machinery of spectacle never stopped. Trapdoors were tested, pulleys reset, torches lit to push back the gloom. The men and women who worked here lived in perpetual twilight, breathing the scent of beasts and decay, hearing the muffled echoes of cheers above but never seeing the light of the arena. And then there were the gladiators who survived. Wounded, exhausted, carried back to their barracks. Some were patched with primitive stitches or cauterized with hot irons. Others lingered in agony, dying not in the glory of combat but in the slow silence of infection. The lucky ones lived to fight another day, their names carried on the lips of the crowd. Fame was possible, even fortune. A gladiator who proved himself could become a legend, adored by women, celebrated by poets, etched into mosaics that survive to this day. But behind the admiration was the simple truth. Each victory only brought them closer to their final defeat. Rome turned men into myths, but only after crushing their humanity. Consider the gladiator who trained for years, endured lash and hunger, won dozens of bouts, and then fell to a single misstep. His name might echo briefly, but his body was discarded as swiftly as a slave who had never fought at all. The sand was impartial. It remembered no one. Even the beasts suffered the same fate. Rome's hunger for exotic animals was insatiable. Lions from Africa, elephants from India, crocodiles from the Nile. Thousands upon thousands were shipped in cramped holds, starved, beaten, and released into the arena only to be slaughtered for sport. Some accounts speak of entire species being driven to extinction, sacrificed for nothing more than a roar of applause. The empire conquered the world not just to rule it, but to bleed it dry for spectacle. What lingered most, though, was the silence after. When night fell and the torches burned low, the Colosseum became a mausoleum. The laughter of the crowd was gone, leaving only the smell of death and the faint drip of water in the hypogeum. Guards paced the corridors, but the ghosts of the fallen seemed to whisper in the stone. Even some Romans admitted the arena was haunted, cursed by the blood it demanded. And yet, the games continued. For centuries, emperors relied on them, citizens clamored for them, and Rome itself became addicted to them. The Colosseum was not just a building. It was a ritual, a heartbeat of cruelty that defined an empire. Every drop of blood in the sand was a reminder. Rome's greatness was built not only on its legions and its laws, but on its willingness to sacrifice human lives for spectacle. This was the cost of power. This was the price of empire. And as we leave the blood-stained sands of Chapter 1, we step next into the theater of cruelty itself, where Rome's ingenuity created spectacles so elaborate, so grotesque, that even the ancients wondered if their civilization had lost its soul. The Colosseum was not only a place of combat, it was a stage, a theater where death was dressed in pageantry. Rome was never content with simple bloodshed. It demanded invention. It demanded spectacle so elaborate that it blurred the line between reality and performance. And the Roman engineers, masters of stone and machinery, gave the empire exactly what it craved. At dawn, the arena might host gladiatorial duels. By midday, it could transform into a hunting ground, forests rising from the sand as hidden mechanisms pushed trees and rocks into place. A man condemned to die might be cast as Actaeon, the hunter of myth, stripped naked and chased by hounds. Another might play Icarus, strung up with wings of wax and feathers, only to plunge to the sand in a staged fall from the heavens. Rome twisted myth into punishment, turning legend into torment. But the ingenuity did not end there. Whole naval battles were staged within the amphitheater. Ancient writers describe how the arena was flooded, ships constructed, and prisoners forced to fight as sailors in a mock sea war. The crowd cheered as triremes clashed, as water turned crimson with blood. Even when the sea was drained, the floor still carried its stains, the sand damp and sticky with salt and gore. The emperors themselves reveled in such excess. Titus, who inaugurated the Colosseum in 80 CE, celebrated with 100 days of games, thousands of animals slaughtered, countless men executed. Later emperors tried to outdo him, staging ever grander shows. Domitian constructed the hypogeum itself, that underground labyrinth of elevators and cages, so that wild beasts could appear suddenly, as if conjured from the depths of the earth. Surprise was everything. Shock was everything. The crowd did not merely want to see death. They wanted to be astounded by how death was delivered. Some executions became grotesque theater. Prisoners were forced to reenact the story of Dirce, the mythological queen tied to a bull and dragged to her death. The condemned woman, bound in chains, was tossed into the arena, where a massive bull gored and trampled her as the crowd howled with delight. To the Romans, this was art. To the condemned, it was terror beyond words. And still, the crowd demanded more. So Rome gave them more. On some festival days, thousands of animals were killed in a single sitting: tigers, leopards, bears, even giraffes. The arena became a mass grave, a cacophony of roars and screams. The slaughter was so great that the sands themselves had to be replaced, carted out in piles heavy with blood and bone. For the emperors, it was proof of power. If Rome could waste life so casually, both human and animal, then Rome truly ruled the world. But even amidst this grandeur, there were whispers. Some Romans looked at the lavish cruelty and wondered whether their civilization had gone mad. The philosopher Seneca wrote of the games with disgust, claiming that he had seen nothing more degrading than men forced to die without resistance, their agony prolonged for laughter. He called it butchery for sport, a sickness of the soul. Yet his words changed nothing. The games went on, because for Rome, cruelty had become culture. To engineer death was not merely entertainment, it was identity. The Colosseum was Rome itself, stone and blood intertwined, each spectacle a reminder of the empire's reach and its hunger. And the question that lingers even now is whether the Romans saw themselves in that sand, or whether the cruelty numbed them so fully that they forgot the cost. By the 2nd century, the Colosseum had become a living organism, its veins running with hidden corridors and its heart pounding with spectacle. The emperors and their architects knew that repetition bred boredom, and boredom was dangerous in a city of 1,000,000 restless souls. To captivate the Roman people, cruelty had to evolve. The hypogeum, that underworld beneath the arena, was central to this evolution. Slaves worked in darkness, heaving at capstans and pulleys, raising platforms that could suddenly release a lion into the sand or lower a gladiator into the earth. The mechanisms were ingenious, nearly magical. To the crowd, it seemed as if the arena itself was alive, devouring men and beasts at will. And the plays, if they can even be called that, were grotesque in their creativity. Condemned criminals became unwilling actors in mythological reenactments. To play Hercules meant being burned alive. To play Icarus meant falling to death from a mechanical contraption. To play Orpheus was to face wild animals disguised as the Furies. The line between art and execution blurred until there was no line at all. Theater was not illusion but reality, and the actors were truly consumed by their roles. The emperors prided themselves on outdoing one another in cruelty. Caligula, though his madness has been colored by rumor, was said to delight in spectacles where prisoners were sawed in half or forced to fight blindfolded. Nero, obsessed with performance, staged elaborate dramas where victims were burned to resemble torches. And Domitian, ever the architect of terror, devised scenes where the condemned were ripped apart by mechanical beasts, creations that were half machine, half animal, and wholly horrifying. But none of it compared to the hunts. Venations, they were called, great slaughters of animals, staged with the grandeur of a military campaign. Thousands of exotic beasts brought from the farthest corners of the empire, elephants from India, rhinoceroses from Africa, bears from the Alps, were loosed into the arena. Some were pitted against hunters with spears, others against each other. A lion starved for days was released against a bear twice its size, the clash of claws and teeth echoing through the stands. And when the beasts lay dead, the crowd demanded more, until the sand itself became a carpet of corpses. The sheer scale of these massacres is almost incomprehensible. Records speak of Emperor Trajan's games, celebrating his victories in Dacia, where 11,000 animals were killed over the course of a single festival. Think of that, 11,000 lives ended for amusement, their bodies discarded like refuse, their cries drowned out by cheers. To Rome, this was proof of power, a demonstration that the empire's wealth and reach were limitless. Yet the cruelty was not random, carried meaning. Executions symbolized Rome's dominance over rebellion, over criminals, over enemies. Animal hunts symbolized man's dominion over nature, Rome's control over the farthest corners of the known world. Naval battles symbolized conquest itself, staged victories on water that mirrored Rome's campaigns abroad. Every spectacle was propaganda, death dressed in symbolism, blood woven into narrative. And so the Colosseum was not only an amphitheater, it was a stage where the empire acted out its myths of supremacy. The spectators were not just entertained, they were indoctrinated. Every roar of the crowd was a chorus of complicity, every gasp of awe a reminder that cruelty was Rome's unifying language. But still, the question lingers. Did the people recognize the horror before them? Or had cruelty become so normalized, so woven into daily life, that the Colosseum spectacles seemed no different than a play, no different than a prayer? The Romans themselves left us conflicting answers. Some accounts speak of citizens fainting at the sight of carnage. Others speak of noble women demanding more, of men grinning as they tossed bets on which fighter would fall first. The truth, perhaps, is that Rome's people became addicted, both horrified and enthralled, unable to look away. This was cruelty elevated to theater, a performance scripted by emperors, enacted by the condemned, consumed by the crowd. A play without mercy, without curtain, without end. And in the shadow of that stage, the soul of Rome darkened. There is a point at which spectacle devours itself. For Rome, that point came not in silence, but in thunder, the roar of crowds demanding more blood than even the empire could provide. The Colosseum, once a marvel of architecture and engineering, had become a furnace that consumed life at a pace almost impossible to sustain. The emperors competed to astonish. Commodus, infamous for his vanity, entered the arena not as ruler but as performer. Draped in gladiators' armor, he fought beasts and men alike, though never without advantage. He killed hundreds of animals from the safety of raised platforms, firing arrows into their hearts, basking in the adoration of a crowd forced to cheer. His reign turned spectacle into mockery, cruelty into farce, but the Colosseum still filled with bodies, spectators, gladiators, slaves, because Rome had grown addicted to its own bloodlust. And yet, the strain was visible. The cost of importing exotic animals alone was staggering. Whole fleets sailed from Africa, laden not with grain or gold, but with cages of lions, elephants, and leopards. Many died on the journey, their corpses dumped into the sea, their suffering never even reaching the arena. Others were starved, beaten, mutilated, forced to fight until their bones cracked. Rome was bleeding the world dry to feed its hunger for wonder. Even the people began to falter. What had once astonished now seemed routine. The spectacle had to grow larger, more grotesque, to stir the same awe. Naval battles became more elaborate, executions more perverse. Some accounts describe criminals dressed in costumes and burned alive to recreate scenes of the underworld. Others speak of entire battalions of prisoners slaughtered at once, their bodies stacked like firewood before being removed in silence. The scale was staggering, but the soul of it was hollow. Writers of the time left us glimpses of the discontent. Tacitus spoke of emperors who used the games to distract from famine and corruption, buying loyalty with death. Seneca, sickened by the butchery, condemned the crowd's appetite as evidence of moral decay. And Juvenal, sharp with irony, mocked a people who traded freedom for bread and circuses, who no longer cared for justice so long as their bellies were full and their eyes entertained. These were voices crying against the storm, drowned out by cheers, but they saw the truth. Cruelty had become Rome's heartbeat, and it was killing the very society it was meant to sustain. Still, the Colosseum stood as proof of Rome's supremacy. Every festival, every execution, every hunt was propaganda etched into blood and stone. The empire was saying, "We can command nature, we can command death, we can command you." And yet, beneath the grandeur, the empire's foundations trembled. An economy that squandered fortunes on spectacle, a people numbed to violence, a ruling class desperate to distract from decline. The theater of cruelty was not just performance, it was prophecy. Because what is an empire that can only hold its people's loyalty through slaughter? What is civilization when its greatest monument is a stage of death? Rome gave the world roads, aqueducts, laws, and yet the Colosseum looms just as large, perhaps larger, in memory. Its arches whisper not only of glory but of blood. The stones themselves, pitted and scarred, seem to remember the cries that once shook their walls. As chapter 2 closes, we leave behind not just the image of cruelty, but its consequence. A society that had grown dependent on spectacle, a people who mistook horror for culture, an empire that traded humanity for grandeur. Rome had perfected the theater of death, but in doing so, it revealed something far darker, that even the most powerful civilization can lose itself in the pursuit of spectacle. And so, as the torches fade on this stage of cruelty, we turn to those who stood at the very heart of it, the condemned, the forgotten, the nameless men and women whose blood wrote Rome's story in the sand. They were not fighters. They were not trained to kill or survive. They were men, women, and sometimes children, slaves, rebels, criminals, Christians, dragged from cells and herded into the Colosseum like cattle toward slaughter. For them, there was no chance of glory, no hope of freedom. They were condemned not to fight, but to die. Their deaths were crafted as theater, designed to satisfy a crowd that demanded novelty. If a gladiator's duel was a contest, the condemned man's execution was a certainty. The Romans even had a term for it, noxii, the guilty ones. But guilt in Rome was malleable. A slave who ran away, a thief who stole bread, a rebel who dared to raise a hand against Rome's legions, a Christian who refused to bow before the gods of the empire. Their guilt was not measured by justice, it was measured by usefulness to spectacle. The condemned were often stripped naked, humiliated before the crowd, their bodies marked not as human but as material for entertainment. Sometimes they were tied to stakes, their arms stretched wide, and left to face starved beasts released into the arena. The lions, often weakened by hunger, pounced savagely, tearing flesh as the crowd howled. There are accounts of the condemned smeared in blood or honey to lure the animals faster, turning their bodies into bait. Other times, execution was masked as mythology. A prisoner might be cast as Ixion, strapped to a burning wheel, his screams echoing through the stands. Another might play Prometheus, chained to the rocks as vultures clawed his flesh. These were not stories told through masks and actors. They were real men dying in real agony, their suffering twisted into theater. And then there were the Christians. To Rome, they were a dangerous sect, stubborn and defiant, refusing to honor the gods or the emperor. In the Colosseum, their deaths were meant as lessons. Men were crucified in rows, their crosses standing tall in the sand as the crowd jeered. Women were thrown to wild beasts, their bodies desecrated as Rome's answer to their faith. And yet, accounts tell of these martyrs singing hymns even as jaws closed upon them, their voices rising above the roar of beasts and men. To the believers, it was not defeat but triumph, a testimony of faith stronger than death itself. But for the majority, there was no song, only silence, only terror. Imagine standing in the hypogeum, hearing the growl of lions just beyond the wooden gates, knowing that when they opened you would be pushed into the light and the sand. Imagine the sound of 50,000 voices chanting for your death, the unbearable weight of their expectation. The condemned entered not as humans but as offerings, and in their final moments, they must have understood that their lives had been reduced to a fleeting thrill for the masses. And after they fell, they were forgotten, their bodies dragged away, their names erased. No tombstones, no rites, no legacy. Only the memory of a scream that vanished into the air, drowned by applause. This is the tragedy of the condemned, that they were not remembered as people, but as shadows in the sand. And yet, in their silence, they tell us the most about Rome. For it is not the glory of gladiators or the grandeur of emperors that reveals a civilization's soul. It is how it treats the powerless, the voiceless, the expendable. And in that mirror, Rome stares back at us with blood on its hands. Picture a slave dragged through the streets of Rome. His ankles are chained, his face swollen from beatings. Around him, children throw stones, men spit, women curse him as he stumbles past. He does not understand their words. He is Gaul or Thracian or Germanic, torn from his homeland by conquest. But he knows hatred when he hears it. By the time he reaches the Colosseum's gates, he is not a man in the eyes of Rome. He is fuel for the games. Slaves like him filled the sands by the thousands. They were not remembered as gladiators, though some were trained into that role. Most were simply noxii, condemned for rebellion, punished for running, or sacrificed to amuse. Their fates were often staged as warnings. Rebels were forced to fight each other, brother against brother, until one stood over the other's corpse. Entire groups were massacred together, cut down not for their crimes but for the example it set. This is what happens when you resist Rome. And then there were the Christians. Their deaths, more than most, have been preserved in memory, sometimes exaggerated by faith, sometimes colored by legend, but always steeped in tragedy. One account tells of a young woman named Perpetua, a noblewoman who refused to renounce her belief. She was thrown into the arena with wild beasts, her body broken, yet she guided the executioner's sword to her own throat when he trembled. Whether myth or truth, her story embodies what terrified Rome most, a faith that did not yield, even in the jaws of death. Other Christians were dressed in crude costumes, mocked as if they were clowns before being slaughtered. Some were set aflame to light the games when the sun went down, human torches illuminating the bloodied sand. To the crowd, this was justice. To the condemned, it was martyrdom. And to history, it became testimony, a reminder that belief can endure even when flesh is destroyed. But not all who perished were remembered as martyrs. Thousands of nameless men and women disappeared into the arena with no voice to carry their story. Their deaths were not tied to faith, nor to legend, but to misfortune. A thief caught stealing bread, a woman accused of adultery, a child taken as punishment for a parent's rebellion. The empire used them all. The Colosseum was not choosy. For the condemned, the cruelty began long before the sand. In the cells below, they sat in darkness, listening to the roars of beasts and the cheers above. The smell of blood seeped through the cracks. Guards tormented them, mocking their fate, sometimes dragging them out to show them the arena before throwing them back into the shadows. Time lost meaning. For some, a single day stretched like an eternity. For others, the waiting was worse than death itself. And when the gates opened, there was no pretense of fairness. The condemned were sent out unarmed, naked, or bound. The crowd did not come to see a contest, they came to see a sacrifice. They wanted screams, terror, pleading. The condemned were forced to play their part, for their pain was the only coin left to them. Afterward, there were no funerals, no prayers. Their bodies were thrown into pits or dumped outside the city walls. Dogs fed on them, bones scattered. In Rome, a condemned man did not deserve remembrance. His life ended not only in death but in erasure. And yet, in their silence, they speak louder than the emperors who ruled them. For the condemned remind us of the human cost beneath the grandeur, the forgotten souls who made the Colosseum run. Rome may have written its history in marble and triumph, but its true record lies in the dust, in the bones of those who screamed and were never heard again. Fear was Rome's truest weapon, and the condemned were its bluntest instrument. Every public execution in the Colosseum was more than punishment, it was propaganda. The empire ruled through spectacle, reminding its people, its slaves, its enemies, this is Rome's power, and this is your fate if you defy it. The condemned taught obedience by dying. They became examples etched into the minds of those who watched. A runaway slave, torn apart by dogs, was a lesson to those still bound in chains. A rebel warrior forced to fight his comrades until he collapsed over their corpses was a warning to every province tempted to rise again. A Christian torn by lions but singing until her voice failed became a message that Rome could not silence dissent, only attempt to devour it. And yet, what Rome intended as a display of strength often sowed seeds it could not control. The blood of Christians spilled in the Colosseum became the lifeblood of their faith. Their deaths, remembered and retold, inspired others far beyond the empire's reach. What was meant to terrify became testimony. What was meant to erase became eternal. But the vast majority of the condemned did not leave behind names or stories. Their deaths did not birth a religion, nor inspire rebellion. They slipped into oblivion, and that, perhaps, is the cruelest tragedy of all. A man could live, love, suffer, and still vanish into silence. His only legacy the echo of laughter that followed his death. It is tempting, centuries later, to imagine that the crowd felt remorse, that someone among those thousands turned away, ashamed at the spectacle of human suffering. But history offers little mercy. The evidence shows that the appetite for death grew, not waned. The condemned were too many, too frequent, too disposable. When one horror lost its edge, the Romans invented another. The condemned became a resource, mined until empty, their humanity dissolved into entertainment. Yet even as they vanished from memory, their suffering endures in the shadow of the Colosseum. When we stand beneath its arches today, we do not hear the names of emperors or the cheers of the crowd. We hear, if we listen closely, the silence of those who died forgotten. That silence lingers heavier than any marble. It whispers of cruelty disguised as culture, of power feeding on the powerless, of men and women turned into fuel for the fleeting thrill of a crowd. The condemned remind us that history is not only made by victors and rulers, it is also written silently, in the blood of those who never had a voice. Their suffering is the darker half of Rome's glory, the shadow that clings to every triumphal arch. They are the ghosts beneath the sand, the forgotten multitude whose lives built the empire's legend at the cost of their own. This was the reality of the condemned and the forgotten. They entered the Colosseum as humans, they died as entertainment, and they left as shadows. And yet, in their shadows, Rome's true face is revealed, not the marble mask of civilization, but the teeth of a predator, hungry and unashamed. The Colosseum was more than stone and sand. It was the pulse of Rome. Every cheer, every scream, every drop of blood reflected the heartbeat of an empire. Emperors understood this. Power in Rome was not merely enforced by armies or law, it was performed. The games were politics, propaganda, and control woven into one grand, horrifying display. Bread and circuses, the saying went, and Rome took it seriously. The people's loyalty was fleeting, their appetite vast. A well-fed citizen distracted by spectacle was less likely to revolt, less likely to question taxes, famine, or corruption. Games were strategically timed, lavishly staged, and ruthlessly engineered to impress. Emperors like Trajan and Titus knew that the public's eyes were the true prize, and they would pay for it in the blood of thousands. The crowds themselves became complicit in the empire's machinery. Citizens cheered at death, wagered on survival, and celebrated the execution of enemies and outcasts. The Colosseum, in essence, was an arena of social conditioning. It taught obedience, reinforced hierarchy, and glorified the emperor's control over life and death. Those who wielded power in Rome were gods in the eyes of the people, or, at least, figures whose will could not be challenged without consequence. Yet this was not merely coercion. There was genuine fascination, even addiction. The masses craved spectacle, and the empire delivered increasingly elaborate forms of it. Exotic animals imported from distant lands, naval battles staged in flooded arenas, mythological dramas ending in real death. These were not acts of necessity, but of excess. The games became an engine of cultural identity. To be Roman was to witness, to participate, to delight in the controlled chaos of empire. And the emperors knew how to exploit it. Political rivals could be removed in the sand under the guise of games. Public opinion could be swayed through awe or terror. Emperors could showcase generosity by feeding the hungry while simultaneously demonstrating dominance by spilling blood. The games were a theater of duality, pleasure and horror, celebration and punishment, freedom and control. Even the elite found themselves enthralled. Senators and noblewomen watched not only for entertainment but for opportunity. Patronage, alliances, influence, all could be gained or lost in the ebb and flow of applause. A well-timed cheer could curry favor. A loud boo could provoke imperial wrath. The Colosseum, in this sense, was not only a place of death. It was a microcosm of Roman power, politics played out in flesh and sand. And yet, beneath the spectacle, cracks were forming. The empire's dependence on games masked deeper instability. When Rome spent fortunes on animals, ships, and performers, it did so while neglecting infrastructure, grain supplies, and welfare. When citizens became addicted to blood for amusement, they became indifferent to suffering elsewhere in the empire. The games were a distraction, but a dangerous one, for they trained the populace to value spectacle over morality, thrill over empathy. It is tempting to see Rome's appetite for blood as mere cruelty, but it was more than that. It was a reflection of power itself, absolute, performative, and intoxicating. The Colosseum, with every roar and cheer, was a reminder that the empire could bend nature, people, and even morality to its will. And yet, the question lingers, as it always does: what does a society become when its culture is built on blood? Rome thrived for centuries, its walls unbroken, its armies unmatched, but the games left an indelible mark. They shaped the psychology of a civilization, creating citizens who celebrated death as entertainment and rulers who measured power by the ability to inspire awe through suffering. The empire's addiction was complete. The Colosseum did not merely reflect Rome, it defined it. Spectacle was power made visible. In Rome, the Colosseum was more than entertainment. It was a tool to mold the mind, to enforce hierarchy, and to consolidate authority. Emperors understood that fear and awe could coexist. A citizen witnessing a mass execution of rebels or criminals saw not only death, but the absolute reach of imperial will. Every roar of approval from the crowd was a reminder. The empire ruled all, even the human spirit. But it was not fear alone that bound Rome. The games also cultivated obsession, a kind of cultural intoxication. The citizens became connoisseurs of cruelty, scholars of spectacle. They debated which gladiator was the most skilled, which beast the most ferocious, which execution most ingenious. Families arrived together, bringing children who would learn from an early age that life was fragile, suffering was spectacle, and power was measured by the capacity to awe. The Colosseum was an education in empire, taught through terror. Emperors leveraged this addiction ruthlessly. When famine threatened or dissent simmered in distant provinces, the games became distraction. Bread was handed out, water provided, and the people were entertained with lavish hunts or staged naval battles. The empire functioned as both benefactor and predator. Citizens were fed and thrilled while their empathy dulled and their attention diverted from the cracks forming in society. The Colosseum's sand was not just red with blood, it was red with control. Political rivals were not immune to this theater. Senators who displeased the emperor might find themselves thrown into the arena, their deaths framed as spectacle, their families silenced by fear. One man's humiliation became the crowd's entertainment, a warning and a lesson. The emperor's power was absolute, and the games demonstrated it with visceral clarity. The Colosseum was the stage upon which political survival was performed, and the audience was complicit in judging, cheering, and condemning. Yet excess carries consequences. Rome's appetite for blood demanded resources that strained even the empire's vast reach. Animals shipped from across continents perished in transit or were exhausted before reaching the arena. Thousands of lives, both human and animal, were expended for the thrill of moments lasting minutes. The logistical and moral cost was staggering. And while the emperors flaunted these spectacles as demonstrations of supremacy, the empire's true strength, the loyalty of its people, the resilience of its provinces, was eroded with each senseless slaughter. The moral contradictions were undeniable. Rome called itself civilized, yet its highest form of entertainment glorified death. It called itself just, yet the condemned were often innocent or powerless. Citizens were taught to admire skill and courage, yet rewarded cruelty and callousness. The Colosseum was the epicenter of this paradox, a place where morality was inverted, where humanity was measured in the ability to survive or inflict suffering. Still, the empire endured because the games were effective. They were the glue that held Rome together, the distraction that masked decay, the ritual that bound citizen and ruler in mutual complicity. The crowd cheered for blood, the emperor provided it, and the cycle continued. In a sense, the Colosseum was more than a building. It was a living organism, feeding on life, sustaining itself through spectacle, and shaping the society that depended on it. Yet, even as the empire celebrated its might, there were murmurs in the shadows. Philosophers, poets, and some senators questioned whether Rome's greatness could survive the moral rot it so openly displayed. Could a civilization built on cruelty, distraction, and spectacle endure? The Colosseum, magnificent and horrifying, offered no answer, only reflection. Its arches mirrored the glory and the darkness of an empire addicted to its own blood. Rome thrived, but it was a civilization enthralled to its appetite. Every festival, every hunt, every execution reinforced the lesson. Power is spectacle, life is expendable, and a society enthralled by blood can lose its soul even as it conquers the world. As the centuries passed, the Colosseum became a mirror of Rome itself, grand, proud, and terrifying. The empire's spectacles were no longer simply entertainment. They had become ritualized expressions of identity, a way to unify the population under a shared language of blood and awe. To be Roman was to witness cruelty and to marvel at it, to understand that power demanded spectacle, and that obedience could be bought or enforced through fear. Legends grew around the games, blending truth and exaggeration until even the most extravagant stories seemed plausible. Tales of emperors ordering the slaughter of thousands of animals, of naval battles staged with entire fleets, of Christians burned alive for sport. They reflected not only what had happened, but what the empire wanted its citizens to believe. The line between fact and narrative blurred. The games became mythic, a theater of power as much in imagination as in reality. This mythology served Rome in subtle ways. The populace, enthralled by spectacle, internalized lessons about hierarchy, obedience, and the cost of rebellion. Provinces that might have resisted were reminded of the empire's reach through tales of the arena. Citizens who might question authority were seduced by grandiosity, entertained into complacency. Even fear became a commodity, distributed evenly across the city through the ritualized cruelty of the games. Yet the cost was not only moral. The obsession with spectacle diverted attention and resources from the empire's practical needs. Money spent on importing animals, constructing elaborate arenas, and orchestrating week-long festivals might have gone to infrastructure, defense, or aid to the poor. Instead, it fueled an addiction that elevated entertainment above empathy, illusion above humanity. Rome's citizens grew accustomed to extremes, their appetite for spectacle insatiable, their tolerance for suffering normalized. Historians debate whether this addiction hastened the decline of Rome or merely reflected it. The empire endured for centuries after the height of the Colosseum spectacles, yet its moral and social fabric was undeniably shaped by them. Citizens and rulers alike were molded by the belief that power could and should be displayed through excess, and that cruelty could be justified as ritual or culture. And the empire's shadow extended far beyond its borders. Stories of the Colosseum traveled across the known world, painting Rome as both magnificent and monstrous. The games became cautionary tales for future civilizations, a testament to the seductive power of spectacle and the dangers of normalizing cruelty. They were warnings that society could celebrate horror and call it culture, and that empires, no matter how mighty, are vulnerable when their glory depends on the blood of the powerless. As the crowds cheered and emperors orchestrated their next displays of ingenuity and horror, the Colosseum stood as both symbol and teacher. It taught that power is performative, that fear is persuasive, and that spectacle can enslave even those who believe themselves free. The empire was addicted not only to the games themselves, but to the order, control, and identity they reinforced. In that addiction lay both its strength and its peril. Chapter 4 closes with a single thought. The spectacle was Rome, and Rome was the spectacle. The lessons of the arena would echo long after the last gladiator fell, long after the bloodstains faded from the sand. They would become legend, myth, and memory, a reflection of both human ingenuity and human depravity. And now, with the empire itself illuminated in the harsh light of its own obsession, we turn to the final chapter, the legacy of horror, the myths, the stories, and the shadow the Colosseum cast across history. The Colosseum stands still, centuries later, a monument to both marvel and terror. Its arches rise against the Roman sky, hollow now, yet resonant with echoes of screams that once shook its stone. Visitors walk its sand-strewn floor, imagining the roar of the crowd, the metallic clash of swords, the roar of starving lions. They come seeking history, yet they encounter memory, the memory of brutality meticulously orchestrated for entertainment. Legends have a way of outliving facts. Tales of gladiators who fought hundreds of foes, of Christians who faced lions with defiant prayer, of emperors whose cruelty knew no bounds. They all feed the myth of Rome's arena. Historians sift through exaggeration and rumor, but the essence remains undeniable. The Colosseum was a theater of horror, a crucible where human ingenuity and cruelty intertwined. It shaped imagination across centuries, influencing art, literature, and popular culture. Every retelling, every reconstruction, carries forward the shadow of suffering that once pooled in the sand. The legacy of horror is not only in memory, but in moral reflection. The Colosseum forces confrontation with questions that are uncomfortable yet timeless. How does a civilization reconcile entertainment with ethics? How does a society measure human life against spectacle? How does power manipulate desire? And how easily can cruelty be normalized when it is packaged as ritual, culture, or tradition? The Romans lived these contradictions daily. They cheered, laughed, and learned from the arena, all while humanity paid in pain. And yet, the arena also speaks to resilience. Some stories defy the cruelty of Rome. Christians who refused to renounce faith, slaves who endured unimaginable suffering, and gladiators who achieved fame or freedom, all remind us that even amid systematic horror, courage, defiance, and survival existed. Their voices, preserved through legend or fragmentary record, offer counterpoints to the empire's relentless appetite. They remind us that history is not only the story of the powerful, but also of those who endured in the margins, whose lives mattered even if they were not celebrated in stone or sand. Over time, the Colosseum became a symbol, not only of Roman ingenuity and imperial grandeur, but of the peril inherent when spectacle eclipses morality. Later civilizations drew inspiration from its architecture, yet few could replicate its psychological impact. The echoes of its cruelty seeped into art, drama, and cautionary storytelling across Europe and the Mediterranean. The very word Colosseum became shorthand for awe, terror, and excess. Even today, visitors often marvel at its scale, admire the engineering, and imagine the glory of empire. But beneath the admiration lies unease, a visceral sense that something sacred has been desecrated by obsession, that greatness was inseparable from suffering. And perhaps that is the Colosseum's enduring lesson. Power and culture are inseparable from the humanity they consume, and the shadow of cruelty can stretch across centuries, long after the stones have stopped bleeding. As the sun sets over the ruins, the Colosseum whispers of its past. The roar of the crowd, the metallic clang of swords, the cries of the condemned, all are gone, yet their imprint lingers. Rome built an empire on stone, law, and conquest, but it also built it on spectacle, and spectacle demanded blood. That is the duality of legacy: awe and horror, civilization and carnage, beauty and suffering. And in the echoing emptiness of the arena, one can almost hear the lesson the Romans left behind. History remembers both the victors and the vanished, and it is in the remembering that humanity confronts itself. Time has softened the edges of Rome's cruelty, but it has not erased them. Stories of the games traveled across continents, carried by historians, poets, and travelers. These tales grew in the telling, mixing fact with imagination, creating legends that haunted the imagination for centuries. Lions roaring, gladiators locked in combat, Christians unbowed in the jaws of beasts. These images became symbols, transcending their historical origins to embody the extremes of human courage, endurance, and cruelty. The Colosseum inspired awe not only for its architecture, but for the psychological power it wielded. Artists and writers in the Renaissance reimagined its spectacles, portraying scenes of horror that were simultaneously thrilling and horrifying. Pain became a lens through which human ingenuity could be admired, even as morality was questioned. Pain, in these retellings, was both spectacle and story, a way to explore the limits of life and the depths of fear. The arena became an enduring motif, a place where tragedy and triumph intertwined in ways that continue to resonate in literature, film, and theater. Yet, alongside fascination came reflection. Philosophers and historians across centuries have debated the ethics of Rome's obsession. The Colosseum raises questions still relevant today. What does a society sacrifice when entertainment eclipses empathy? How easily can violence become normalized when it is framed as culture or ritual? The Romans, in their pursuit of spectacle, inadvertently created a mirror for every civilization that followed, a warning etched in stone and sand that power, when divorced from morality, corrodes society from within. The mythologized stories of heroes and martyrs preserved in memory offer another layer to this legacy. Christians who defied death, gladiators who achieved fame, slaves who endured unspeakable torment. They remind us that even in systems of total domination, individuals leave marks that endure. These figures challenge the narrative of the arena as purely one of horror. They represent resilience, defiance, and the capacity of the human spirit to endure and inspire, even in the face of systematic cruelty. And yet, for every remembered figure, countless others vanished without a trace. The nameless condemned, whose lives were consumed for the amusement of a city, remain shadows beneath history. Their anonymity intensifies the weight of the Colosseum's legacy. It is not only a monument to empire and ingenuity, but a monument to suffering itself. The stones remember, if memory can reside in stone, and in remembering, they confront every visitor with the cost of spectacle. The Colosseum's influence also endures in the imagination of modern society. From literature to cinema, from art to architecture, the archetype of the arena, the place where humans are tested, displayed, and consumed, continues to fascinate. The thrill of combat, the fascination with courage and cruelty, the interplay of performance and real danger, all echo the traditions of Rome, reminding us that even centuries later, the lessons and warnings of the arena remain relevant. And perhaps most haunting of all is the realization that the Colosseum's shadow is not confined to the past. Its lessons reach forward, questioning the ethics of entertainment, the nature of spectacle, and the human appetite for violence. Rome's legacy is a mirror. It shows both the heights of human ingenuity and the depths of human cruelty, intertwined in a pattern that continues to challenge the conscience. As dusk falls over the ancient ruins, the arena is silent, yet its story continues to speak. Power, spectacle, courage, cruelty, they coexist in its arches, in its sands, in the memory of all who enter. Rome may be gone, its empire fallen, yet the lessons of the Colosseum endure, warning, inspiring, and haunting in equal measure. The Colosseum is more than a ruin. It is a mirror, reflecting both the ingenuity and the darkness of humanity. Its arches rise as silent witnesses to the centuries of suffering, the screams swallowed by stone and time. Visitors today can walk its corridors, stand on its sand-strewn floor, and imagine the life, the terror, and the spectacle that once filled its heart. And yet, imagination cannot fully capture what it was like to live, to suffer, to die within these walls. The empire that built it may have fallen, its legions scattered, its emperors forgotten, but the arena endures as a warning. It teaches that civilization's greatest achievements can coexist with its greatest cruelties, that spectacle can both inspire and corrupt, that awe can blind morality. The Colosseum is not simply a monument to Rome. It is a monument to the cost of power, to the price of human fascination, and to the fragility of compassion in the shadow of authority. The echoes of the condemned still resonate. The gladiators who fought with skill, the slaves who trembled beneath chains, the Christians who faced death with faith, the nameless men and women devoured by beasts, they all remain in the memory of the arena. Their suffering reminds us that history is never solely the story of victors. It is also the story of the powerless, whose lives are consumed, erased, or mythologized. The Colosseum is both tomb and stage, preserving not just glory, but loss. In that duality lies its enduring power. We marvel at its architecture, study its history, and thrill at the tales of courage and defiance. Yet we are also haunted by the cost, the unimaginable human suffering that fueled its grandeur. It is a place of contradictions, of awe and horror entwined, and perhaps that is why it endures. The lessons of the arena transcend time. The appetite for spectacle can mesmerize as much as it can destroy, and power exercised without empathy leaves shadows that stretch across centuries. As the sun sets over the ruins, the Colosseum's silhouette casts long, uneven shadows over the sand, echoes of lives lived and lost, of screams and cheers mingled into memory. Rome built an empire on stone, strategy, and spectacle. It also built an empire on fear, suffering, and the willing complicity of its people. That is the enduring story, the lesson, the warning, and the haunting legacy that remains. The arena is silent now, but its voice is louder than ever. It speaks to us across millennia, urging reflection, warning against the seduction of power, and reminding us that the grandeur of civilization is inseparable from the lives it consumes. The Colosseum stones are permanent, but its lessons are living. In remembering the blood-stained sand, we remember ourselves and the choices we make as spectators, citizens, and human beings. Rome is gone, but the arena's shadow is eternal, and as long as we listen, we are forced to confront it.